The late summer sun hung low over Willow Creek, Ohio, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose as it sank behind the endless fields of corn and soybean. Mason Caldwell stood on the wide porch of his two-story home, a sturdy brick house he'd built himself on a quiet plot by the creek. At 55, Mason was a man who carried his past in the lines of his face and the calluses on his hands. Born in a sagging trailer park on the edge of Youngstown, he'd grown up in a world of rust and want. A father who drowned his days in cheap whiskey, a mother who vanished when Mason was 9, leaving behind a note that said only, "I can't stay." The kids at school sneered, calling him trailer trash, their words like knives carving into his pride. But Mason had a spark, a relentless drive to prove them wrong, to build something that would outlast their scorn. By 18, he was lugging 2x4s at a construction site, sweat soaking his flannel shirt, learning the rhythm of hammer and nail from foremen who'd seen too many kids give up. They saw something different in Mason: grit, hunger, a refusal to break. He soaked up their lessons, staying late to study blueprints, teaching himself the math of load-bearing walls and the art of a perfect joint. By his late 20s, he'd saved enough to start Caldwell Construction, a scrappy outfit run out of a rented garage. It was slow going at first, long nights bidding on jobs, rejections from banks who didn't trust a kid with no pedigree. But Mason didn't quit. A small contract for a strip mall in Canton led to a housing development in Akron, then bigger projects across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Now, Caldwell Construction employed 200 workers, its logo plastered on billboards along I-70, a symbol of a man who'd turned dirt into dreams. This house was his trophy. Not a mansion, but solid. Red brick, white trim, a wraparound porch where he could sit and hear the creek whisper through the willows. Inside, oak floors gleamed under ceiling fans, and the kitchen smelled of Ellen's baking. Mason had met Ellen Harper 30 years ago at the Willow Creek Diner, a greasy spoon where truckers swapped stories and the coffee was always burnt. He was 25, still driving a rattling Ford pickup, his jeans patched at the knees. Ellen was 22, her auburn hair tied back, her smile a burst of warmth in the gray morning. She'd teased him about tracking mud across her clean floor, but when he talked about his plans, a company, a legacy, her hazel eyes held his, steady and bright. "You're gonna be somebody, Mason Caldwell," she'd said, sliding an extra slice of pie across the counter. They married a year later in the town's Methodist church, Mason in a borrowed suit, Ellen in a simple lace dress her mother had sewn. He'd promised her everything: security, love, a life better than the one he'd known. Their son, Ethan, arrived a year after, a squalling bundle with Mason's stubborn jaw. 3 years later came Lily, with Ellen's quick laugh and a knack for wrapping her dad around her finger. Mason worked 16-hour days to keep the business afloat, leaving before dawn, coming home to find Ellen asleep on the couch, a book splayed across her chest. She made their house a home, painting Ethan's room with soccer balls, stitching quilts for Lily's bed, hosting barbecues for the neighbors. To Mason, Ellen was the heart of it all, the woman who turned his grind into meaning. Willow Creek loved him for it. He wasn't just a boss, he was one of them. He coached Ethan's Little League team, donated lumber for the church's new fellowship hall, hired local teens to sweep his job sites. At the county fair, folks clapped him on the back, thanking him for the jobs, the sponsorships, the way he'd put their town on the map. But the grind had a price. Mason missed Ethan's first goal, Lily's first recital, too many nights tucking them in. He'd apologize, guilt heavy in his chest, and Ellen would kiss his temple, her voice soft. "You're giving them a future, Mason. That's what matters." Now Ethan was 27, a structural engineer engaged to Sarah Bennett, a kind-eyed teacher from a Dayton family with deep roots. Lily, 24, was in nursing school in Columbus, her texts full of sarcasm and ambition. Mason stood on the porch, the iced tea gone warm in his hand, fireflies flickering in the twilight. The house felt too big, too still, with the kids gone and Ellen spending evenings at church or her book club. He told himself it was just age creeping in, the ache of a life well lived. He had a family, a business, a town that called him their own. What more could he need? But as the creek murmured and the stars began to prick the sky, A shadow lingered in Mason's gut. Something wasn't right. A tremor, faint but real, like the first crack in a foundation before the whole house comes down. Mason Caldwell leaned back in his worn leather chair, the hum of the ceiling fan filling the quiet of his home office in Willow Creek, Ohio. The house by the creek was a sanctuary, its walls lined with family photos. Ethan's gap-toothed grin at a Little League game, Lily's prom dress sparkling under the flash, and Ellen, her auburn hair catching the light in a snapshot from their 10th anniversary picnic. At 55, Mason believed his 30-year marriage to Ellen Harper was the bedrock of his life, a steady anchor through the storms of building Caldwell construction from a Youngstown trailer park to a regional name. Ellen was his partner, his confidant, the woman who'd made their family whole. But lately, a faint unease had crept into his thoughts, like a draft you feel but can't find. Ellen was the heart of Willow Creek, as much a fixture as the Methodist church steeple. She was 52 now, her laugh still bright, her hazel eyes warm when she poured coffee at the diner years ago or handed out programs at the county fair. She'd given up waitressing when Ethan was born, turning her energy to their home and kids. The house smelled of her cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings, and the backyard rang with laughter from barbecues she hosted for neighbors. Ellen was the mom who organized PTA bake sales, sewed costumes for the school play, and never missed Ethan's soccer games or Lily's piano recitals, even when Mason was stuck at a job site. To him, she was perfect, not flawless, but fiercely loyal, the one who'd stood by him when banks laughed at his startup dreams. "We're in this together, Mason," she'd say, her hand squeezing his after another late night. But perfection, Mason was starting to notice, had cracks. Ellen's schedule had grown busier over the years, filled with church committees, book clubs, and girls' nights at the diner with old co-workers. She'd always been social, her phone buzzing with texts from friends, her calendar marked with community events. Mason didn't mind. It gave her joy, and he was often too buried in contracts to join her. Yet, her absences felt different now, longer, vaguer. She'd come home from a church meeting with her hair slightly mussed, her cheeks flushed, explaining she'd stayed late to help decorate the fellowship hall, or she'd mention a last-minute errand to Dayton, her voice quick, eyes not quite meeting his. Mason brushed it off, blaming his own exhaustion, but the doubts lingered, small and sharp, like splinters under the skin. Then there was Ryan Kessler, Mason's old friend and former business partner at Caldwell Construction. Ryan was 54, a charismatic contractor with a quick grin and a knack for closing deals. He'd joined Mason's company in the early days, back when they were pouring foundations together, sharing beers after long shifts. Ryan had been best man at their wedding, his toast about Mason and Ellen's unbreakable love bringing tears to the room. When Ethan was born, Ryan was the first to visit, joking he'd teach the kid to swing a hammer. But Ryan had a restless edge, a charm that sometimes felt too slick. 5 years ago, he'd left the company after a dispute over a botched project. Mason had covered the losses, keeping it quiet to protect their friendship. Ryan started his own firm, Kessler Builds, and stayed in Willow Creek, a regular at community events, always with a handshake and a story. Ellen and Ryan had always been close, a friendship Mason never questioned. Ryan would drop by for barbecues, help Ellen with the church's annual rummage sale, or join her at the fair to judge the pie contest. Mason liked their ease, the way Ellen laughed at Ryan's bad puns, the way Ryan called her the boss with a wink. But lately, Mason noticed patterns. A glance between them at the last 4th of July picnic. Too long to be casual. A text from Ryan Ellen didn't open when Mason was near. Her sudden interest in consulting for Ryan's new downtown project, despite no experience in construction. "It's just volunteering, Mason," she'd said, her tone light but clipped. "Ryan needs help with permits." Mason nodded, swallowing the question he didn't want to ask. The town saw nothing amiss. To Willow Creek, the Caldwells were the ideal family, Mason the hardworking hero, Ellen the devoted wife, their kids the pride of the community. Ethan, now 27, was planning his wedding to Sarah Bennett, a teacher whose family owned a farm outside Dayton. Lily, 24, was excelling in nursing school, her sharp wit a hit at family dinners. Mason clung to this image, the life he'd built brick by brick. But at night, when Ellen was at another book club and the house was too still, He'd stare at their wedding photo on his desk, Ellen's smile radiant, his own face full of hope, and wonder if he'd missed something. Had her warmth always been this practiced? Were her late nights really about the church? Mason pushed the thoughts down, focusing on Ethan's upcoming wedding. He wanted it perfect, a celebration of the family he'd fought for. Ellen was in her element, planning the rehearsal dinner, her laughter filling the house as she debated centerpieces with Sarah. "We've got this, Mason," she said, kissing his cheek, her touch familiar yet distant. He smiled, wanting to believe her, wanting to trust the life they'd built. But as he watched her drive off to another errand, her phone lighting up with a new message, that unease grew, a quiet tremor in the foundation of his world, threatening to crack everything he held dear. The fluorescent lights buzzed in the cluttered office of Caldwell Construction, where Mason Caldwell sat hunched over a stack of invoices, the clock ticking past 8 p.m. on a chilly October evening in Willow Creek, Ohio. At 55, he was no stranger to late nights, but tonight felt heavier, the air thick with a restless edge he couldn't shake. While sorting through a pile of paperwork from a recent job, he found a folded receipt tucked inside an envelope of expense reports, its ink faded but legible. Starlight Motel, Dayton, room 112, one night, $89, paid cash, dated August 15th. Mason's breath caught. He hadn't been to Dayton since a supplier meeting last year, and he and Ellen always chose quaint inns for their occasional trips, never a nondescript motel like this. The receipt didn't belong to him. His mind flashed to August, when Ellen had driven to Dayton for a fundraiser with the church's outreach group. She'd come home after midnight, her scarf loose, her eyes darting as she mumbled about sorting donations till late. Mason had been half asleep, accepting her words without a second thought, too drained from a 14-hour workday. Now, the receipt sat like a splinter in his palm, sharp and undeniable, pulling at the threads of their 30-year marriage. He shoved the papers aside and drove home, the town's quiet streets blurring past, the glow of porch lights mocking the storm brewing inside him. Ellen was out again, at a charity meeting, her sedan absent from the garage. Mason entered their house, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. The living room, with its plaid sofa and framed family photos, felt like a stranger's space. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom, his heart pounding, and paused at Ellen's dresser. Guilt gnawed at him, but the receipt's weight in his pocket pushed him forward. In the bottom drawer, under a pile of her folded cardigans, he found a small prepaid phone, sleek, black, not her usual iPhone. He powered it on, the screen glowing with one saved contact. R.K. Ryan Kessler. Mason's throat tightened. Ryan, his friend of decades, the man who'd laughed with him over beers, who'd stood at his side when he vowed to love Ellen forever. The phone held no messages, no call history, erased, meticulous, but its secrecy roared louder than any proof. The discovery was a blade, but another wound followed. 2 days earlier, Mason had been combing through old financial records for an IRS audit, a task he'd dreaded. He'd noticed a gap in the books. $50,000 unaccounted for in a 2018 retail project Ryan had managed before leaving Caldwell Construction. At the time, Mason had written it off as a bookkeeping mistake, quietly covering the loss to keep the company's name clean and their friendship intact. Now, the missing money loomed, a betrayal as cold as the motel receipt. Ryan hadn't just taken from Mason's business, he'd taken from their bond, their history, and, it seemed, from Ellen's heart. Mason slumped against the dresser, the phone and receipt in his hands, his world tilting. Ellen, who'd braided Lily's hair for school dances, who'd tucked love notes in his lunchbox during lean years, had hidden this. Ryan, who'd taught Ethan to ride a bike, who'd called Mason brother at their 20th anniversary party, had crossed a line that shattered trust. The life they'd built, Sunday potlucks, town fairs, the Caldwells as Willow Creek's golden family, was a lie. A fragile shell Mason had been too busy to see cracking. He thought of Ethan, 27, planning his wedding to Sarah, and Lily, 24, chasing her nursing degree. They deserved better than this deceit. He returned the phone to the drawer, slipped the receipt into his wallet, and stood in the darkened room. Ellen would walk through the door soon, her voice cheerful, her lies polished. Mason's chest ached, not with rage, but with a grief so deep it stole his breath. The marriage he'd cherished, the friendship he'd valued, were unraveling, and he was left holding the pieces. Ethan's wedding loomed, a fragile thread of joy in the chaos. Mason latched onto it, needing something to anchor him. He walked to the window, the town's lights faint through the fog, and felt a quiet shift inside, a determination to uncover the full truth, no matter how much it hurt. The oak-paneled walls of attorney Laura Mitchell's office in downtown Canton glowed under the morning light, a stark contrast to the storm still raging in Mason Caldwell's heart. It was late November, a week after Ethan's wedding, where Mason's slideshow had unveiled Ellen's affair with Ryan Kessler and Ryan's $50,000 theft from Caldwell Construction. The barn reception had frozen when the screen flashed the motel receipt, Ryan's bank records, and the burner phone's RK contact. Gasps rippled through the crowd, Ellen's face drained of color, and Ryan fled before the toasts ended. Mason, 55, stood tall that night, his voice steady as he apologized to Ethan and Sarah, ensuring the wedding continued. But now, in Laura's office, he was rebuilding, not just his heart, but his legacy. Laura, a sharp-eyed lawyer who'd known Mason since his early days, spread documents across her desk, asset lists, company valuations, trust agreements. "You've got options, Mason," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But we need to move fast to protect what's yours." Ellen's betrayal had fractured their marriage, and Ryan's embezzlement threatened the business Mason had built from a Youngstown trailer park. He wouldn't let either destroy Ethan and Lily's future. With Laura's help, Mason began restructuring Caldwell Construction, transferring key assets into a trust for his children. The main office, a warehouse, and several land parcels were secured, untouchable by Ellen's potential divorce claims or Ryan's financial fallout. Mason also met with his accountant, Greg Patel, a meticulous man who'd flagged irregularities in the 2018 books. Greg confirmed Ryan's theft wasn't a one-off. Smaller sums, cleverly hidden, had vanished over years. Mason authorized a forensic audit, uncovering $75,000 in total losses. He filed a civil suit against Ryan, seeking restitution and damages, and tipped off the county prosecutor about possible fraud. Ryan's Kessler Builds was crumbling under scrutiny, its contracts drying up as word spread. Mason didn't savor the ruin, but justice felt right, a balance for the pain Ryan had caused. Back in Willow Creek, the town buzzed with whispers. The Caldwells, once the ideal family, were now a cautionary tale. Ellen had moved to her sister's house in Akron, her absence loud in the community. She'd called Mason twice, her voice trembling, offering apologies he couldn't yet hear. At the church, where she'd once led bake sales, heads turned when her name was mentioned. Mason felt the stares too, at the gas station, the diner, but he held his head high. Ethan, 27, and Sarah were honeymooning in Colorado, shielded from the worst gossip. Lily, 24, home from nursing school, clung to Mason, her anger at Ellen raw, but unspoken. Mason's nights were sleepless, spent in the house that once felt like a home. The kitchen, where Ellen's laughter used to echo, was silent, her recipe books untouched. Yet, he found purpose in the rebuild. He promoted a loyal foreman, Dan Carter, to oversee daily operations, freeing Mason to focus on strategy. He negotiated a new contract for a Columbus housing project, ensuring the company's cash flow. Most importantly, he set up education funds for Ethan and Lily, guaranteeing their dreams, Sarah's teaching, Lily's nursing, wouldn't falter. One evening, Mason drove to the creek behind his house, the water glinting under a fading sky. The wedding's chaos, Ellen's lies, Ryan's greed, they'd nearly broken him. But as he stood there, the weight of his choices settled. The trust, the lawsuit, the funds. He'd protected his kids, his business, his name. The town might whisper, and his heart might ache. But Mason was no longer the boy from the trailer park, scrambling for scraps. He was a man who'd built something enduring, and he'd fight to keep it. The future was uncertain, Ellen's next move, Ryan's fate. But Mason felt a quiet strength, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The soft clink of coffee mugs filled the back booth of Willow Creek's diner, where Mason Caldwell sat across from his old friend, Tom Delaney, a private investigator with a knack for digging up secrets. It was a crisp November morning, 2 weeks before Ethan's wedding, and Mason's eyes were shadowed, his jaw tight. Since finding the motel receipt and burner phone 3 weeks ago, he'd carried a simmering anger, tempered by a cold resolve. Ellen's betrayal with Ryan Kessler, coupled with Ryan's theft of $50,000 from Caldwell Construction, wasn't just personal. It was a wound to everything Mason had built. He couldn't let it slide, not with Ethan's wedding looming, a day meant to celebrate family. Mason wanted truth, not chaos, but he needed it exposed in a way that left no room for lies. Tom sipped his coffee, scribbling notes as Mason recounted the evidence. Ellen's vague excuses, Ryan's lingering glances, the Dayton motel, the hidden phone with RK saved. "I need proof, Tom," Mason said, voice low. "Something undeniable before the wedding." Tom nodded, his weathered face serious. He'd seen too many marriages crumble to sugarcoat things, but he knew Mason wasn't after petty revenge. This was about justice, about protecting Ethan and Lily from a facade. Tom agreed to tail Ellen and Ryan, dig into Ryan's finances, and check the motel's records. "Give me 10 days, he said. "You'll have what you need." Mason spent those days in a haze of work and pretense. At home, Ellen was her usual self, planning the wedding with Sarah, fussing over table settings, her laughter bright as she hung fairy lights in the backyard. Mason played along, nodding at her suggestions, but each smile felt like a lie he swallowed. He watched her closely, noting her quick glances at her phone, the way she'd step outside to take calls. At night, he lay awake, the sting of her deceit sharper in the dark. Ryan, meanwhile, was everywhere, dropping by to help with wedding prep, his grin too easy, his hand lingering too long when he passed Ellen a box of decorations. Mason's blood boiled, but he kept silent, his plan taking shape. Tom delivered 8 days later, meeting Mason at a park bench by the creek. The envelope he handed over was thin but heavy. Photos of Ellen and Ryan at a Dayton coffee shop, their hands brushing. A motel clerk's statement confirming Ryan's frequent stays, always cash, often with a woman matching Ellen's description. Bank records showing Ryan's shady transfers from 2018, linked to the $50,000 hole in Mason's books. The evidence was a gut punch, but it fueled Mason's focus. He wouldn't confront them privately, that was too easy. Ethan's wedding, with the whole town gathered, was the stage, not to ruin it, but to unveil the truth where it couldn't be ignored. Mason met with Sarah's father, John Bennett, a respected farmer and church deacon. Without revealing Ellen's role, Mason shared Ryan's embezzlement, framing it as a business betrayal. John, appalled, agreed to keep Ryan away from the wedding's inner circle, limiting his role to guest. Mason then spoke to the venue's AV tech, a young guy who owed him a favor from a summer job. He handed over a USB drive with a slideshow, family photos, Ethan and Sarah's love story, and, at the end, a single slide. A scanned motel receipt, Ryan's bank records, and a photo of the burner phone's RK contact. It would play during the reception, after the toasts, when Ellen and Ryan would be seated exposed to all. The plan was surgical, not explosive. Mason didn't want screams or fights. He wanted clarity for Ethan, Lily, and the town to see the truth. He wrestled with the pain of humiliating Ellen, the woman he'd loved for decades, but her lies had left him no choice. Ryan's theft and arrogance deserved no mercy. As the wedding neared, Mason drove to the venue, a rustic barn strung with lights, and stood alone in the empty space. The ache in his chest was raw, but so was his determination. He'd built his life on honesty, and he'd tear down the lies, even if it broke his heart. Snow dusted the gravel lot outside Willow Creek's community center, where Mason Caldwell stood, breath fogging in the December chill. It was 6 weeks after Ethan's wedding, where his slideshow had shattered the town's image of the Caldwells, exposing Ellen's affair with Ryan Kessler and Ryan's $75,000 theft from Caldwell Construction. At 55, Mason felt the weight of those weeks, the whispers at the hardware store, the quiet support from old friends, the trust funds he'd secured for Ethan and Lily. But tonight, He was here for the town's Christmas bazaar, helping set up tables, determined to show Willow Creek he was still standing. His life had cracked, but he was piecing it together, one steady step at a time. The bazaar hummed with chatter, lights twinkling above stalls of quilts and cider. Mason was stacking chairs when a familiar voice stopped him cold. "Mason." Ellen stood by the hot cocoa stand, her coat buttoned tight, her hazel eyes searching. She'd been in Akron since the wedding, her calls unanswered, her apologies unheard. Now she was back, claiming she wanted to make things right. Mason's chest tightened, not with anger, but with a hollow pang. He nodded curtly, excusing himself to carry chairs, but her presence lingered, a shadow over the festive glow. Ellen joined the crowd, helping at a craft table, her smile tentative as neighbors glanced her way. The town hadn't forgiven her, and neither had Mason. Later, in the center's kitchen, Lily, 24, pulled Mason aside. "She's here for Ethan's holiday visit," she said, her voice sharp. Ethan and Sarah were due back from Colorado tomorrow, and Lily, home from nursing school, dreaded the tension. "She's staying at the inn, not with us," Lily added, her loyalty to Mason clear. Mason hugged her, grateful for her strength, but Ellen's return stirred questions. Was she here for forgiveness or something else? He'd heard from Laura Mitchell, his lawyer, that Ellen had hired an attorney, possibly eyeing a divorce settlement. Mason had protected his assets, but the thought of legal battles, after all they'd shared, cut deep. Then came Ryan's move. A letter arrived from Ryan's lawyer, accusing Mason of defamation, claiming the wedding slideshow had ruined Kessler Builds. Ryan demanded $200,000 to settle, threatening a public lawsuit that could drag Caldwell Construction's name through the mud. Mason met Laura at her Canton office, her desk now piled with case files. "He's bluffing," Laura said, her eyes narrowing. "His fraud evidence is airtight against him, but he's banking on you avoiding a fight." Mason clenched his jaw. Ryan's gall, after stealing, after Ellen, ignited a fire in him. He told Laura to countersue, not just for the $75,000, but for legal fees and reputational harm. He wouldn't let Ryan rewrite the truth. Mason threw himself into work, guiding Caldwell Construction through a new Columbus contract. Dan Carter, his promoted foreman, ran the crews smoothly, and Greg Patel, the accountant, kept the books clean. At home, Ethan and Sarah's return brought warmth, laughing over dinner, planning their new apartment. Lily's sharp humor lit up the table, but Ellen's shadow loomed. She'd asked to join them for Christmas Eve, and Mason, after talking with his kids, agreed, but only at the community center's service. He wasn't ready for her in his home. On Christmas Eve, Mason stood by the creek, snow falling softly. Ellen's return, Ryan's threats, the town's eyes, they tested his resolve. But he thought of Ethan's smile, Lily's courage, the business he'd saved. He'd lost a marriage, a friend, but gained clarity. His kids, his work, his truth were his anchor. As church bells rang in the distance, Mason felt a spark of hope, not for reconciliation, but for a life rebuilt on his terms, ready for whatever challenges came next. The flicker of candles lit the Willow Creek Church, their glow dancing across pews as hymns filled the air on Christmas Eve. Mason Caldwell, 55, stood near the back, his coat dusted with snow, watching Ethan and Sarah sway to the music, Lily at their side. 6 weeks after the wedding slideshow that exposed Ellen S.'s affair with Ryan Kessler, and Ryan's his $75,000 theft, Mason had rebuilt his life. Trust funds for his kids, a thriving Caldwell Construction, a countersuit against Ryan's defamation claim. But tonight, Ellen's presence, agreed upon for this service, stirred the air. She sat 3 rows ahead, her scarf loose, her posture stiff, the town's eyes darting between her and Mason. As the choir sang, Ellen turned, catching Mason's gaze. After the final hymn, she approached, her voice low. "I was wrong, Mason. I broke us. But I want to see Ethan and Lily, to fix something." Her eyes glistened, but Mason saw Lily tense, her arms crossed. "You don't get to decide that now," Lily said, her voice sharp, Ethan nodding beside her. Mason stayed silent, his heart torn. Ellen's regret seemed real, but her betrayal still stung. He agreed to a family meeting after New Year's, but only with boundaries, for his kids' sake. Ellen nodded, tears falling, and left the church alone, the congregation whispering as she passed. Ryan's next move hit harder. On X, posts from an anonymous account, clearly Ryan, accused Mason of faking evidence, claiming Caldwell Construction was corrupt. The lies spread fast, threatening Mason's Columbus contract. Laura Mitchell, his lawyer, called him to her Canton office, her desk now a war room. Ryan's defamation suit collapsed yesterday, she said, a smile breaking through. The judge ruled in our favor, $75,000 restitution, plus $50,000 in damages. But Ryan's ex-posts demanded a response. Mason, with Laura's guidance, prepared a statement for the town hall's New Year's meeting, where Willow Creek's leaders gathered. The town hall was packed, string lights glowing outside, the mood tense as Mason took the podium. He held up the motel receipt, Ryan's bank records, and a court document, his voice steady. I built this company from nothing, for my family, for this town. Ryan Kessler stole from me, lied about me, and hurt us all. Here's the truth. He shared the judge's ruling, Greg Patel's audit findings, and a photo of the burner phone's RK contact. The crowd murmured, then clapped, their trust in Mason restored. Posts on X praising his honesty drowned out Ryan's lies, and Kessler Builds lost its last client. Ryan, humiliated, left town days later, his legacy in ruins. Back home, Ethan, Sarah, and Lily rallied around Mason. Over cocoa, they planned the family meeting with Ellen, setting terms. Honesty, no excuses. Ethan spoke of forgiveness, but Lily held firm, her pain raw. Mason felt pride in their strength, their unity a balm for his scars. He also launched a community project, a youth center funded by Caldwell Construction, with Dan Carter leading the build. It was his way of giving back, of rooting his legacy deeper in Willow Creek. On New Year's Eve, Mason stood at the town square, lights twinkling, the youth center's groundbreaking announced to cheers. Ethan and Lily flanked him, Sarah smiling nearby, the town's applause warm. Ellen watched from the crowd, her face unreadable, her future with the family uncertain. Ryan was gone, his lies buried. Mason's heart still carried an ache, but it beat with purpose. He'd lost much but gained more, a family unbroken, a town united, a life reclaimed. As fireworks lit the sky, he looked forward, ready for a new chapter, whatever it held.